Welcome to Sociology 102, Police Violence, Black Lives Matter, and the COVID-19 Pandemic. Today we'll discuss the book Predict and Surveil, Data, Discretion, and the Future of Policing, with its author, Dr. Sarah Brayne. I'm your instructor, Professor Wary, and I'm especially pleased today to welcome Dr. Brayne back to Princeton. You received your PhD in sociology from Princeton, and I just wish we could have had you back in person, but next year.
Absolutely, one day.
Pass one day when the troubles pass. I'm really excited, particularly given the work that you're doing and how timely it is. So our students have read your 2017 article in the American Sociological Review, where you talk about big data and policing. And so for putting it into plain speak, what exactly does that look like to you?
Yeah, so big data is kind of this buzzword that came about 10 or so years ago that people sometimes use in conjunction with words like AI or algorithms. But at its core, big data is simply vast and varied scores of information that has been digitized. And so if you think about like all of the digital traces that you've left today, so for example, I've already used my cell phone, sent some emails, gone on social media, purchased something online, all of those digital traces that we leave in our wake, when combined together, that's big data. And so when doing big data analytics, it often involves using that data about the past in order to make predictions about the future. So in the context of policing, police surveillance basically means that instead of just having one officer visually observing or surveilling one individual, officers are able to leverage these vast scores of information about people in order to engage in much broader and wider and deeper surveillance.
Yeah, and when you were doing this work, you spent 2 years with the Los Angeles Police Department. And I'm imagining you didn't just walk through the front door and say, by the way, I'm a sociologist, I'm going to study big data. Don't worry, some of it's going to be critical, but don't worry about it. But I'm here. So how did you get in there?
Yeah, it was a little bit harder than that, a little longer of a story. But yeah, I mean, so the short answer was that it was quite difficult to get access. Sometimes people talk about what's called the blue wall of silence in policing, and that's sort of notorious, and it makes it difficult for researchers and to a certain extent journalists, members of the public, to gain the level of access to a police department that one would need in order to really like study in depth day-to-day policing practices. So because I have to protect my respondents' anonymity, I can't describe like exactly my entree in detail, but there's a couple of points that might be helpful for students if they're interested in doing similar such work in the future. So the first point with that is that I tried to enter the LAPD relatively high in the organizational chart. So what I mean by that is that like police departments are very hierarchical institutions. And so I figured if I was able to gain access, get someone who would agree to let me hang around basically and talk to them relatively high up in the org, then those permissions would cascade down the ranks. A sergeant would say, well, if my captain is saying that she can be here, I guess it's fine. Whereas if I entered low in the chart, it would be like those permissions, I would have to ask every single time in order to gain that sort of permission. And so essentially what ended up happening was in conjunction with some academics at another institution, I heard that there was someone relatively high up in the department that was very excited about the use of big data and that kind of thing. And I essentially asked, can you show me all of the ways in which you use data in your everyday work? And then what happened is I did what's called snowball sampling. So I actually moved out to LA based on one person agreeing to do one interview with me. And I decided, I'll just do 6 weeks and see if it works. And at the end of every interview, that interview concluded and I said, okay, thanks for your time. Can I go on a ride along? And he was like, yeah, okay, sure. And, then I go on a ride along with someone, and throughout the ride along, the sergeant mentions different people. And I say, wait, can you give me their email address? And I did this process of snowball sampling for the first 6 weeks. So that was pretty tough. There was like definitely a lot of cold calls and like unanswered emails and loitering around offices and that kind of thing. But I did find after that, after I established these working relationships, the fieldwork became much more free flowing, where it wasn't me sort of fighting to get access, but actually people started inviting me to go on ride-alongs or attend meetings and that kind of thing. So it really transformed in that way.
Yeah. Whenever I talk about surveillance, some people will just say to me, if people aren't doing anything wrong, they shouldn't be worried about big data. They shouldn't be worried about surveillance. And so what do you say to that?
Yeah, that argument of like, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear is a very common one, and I understand it, and I'm sympathetic to it to a certain extent. But what I would say is that that argument really rests on an assumption, and it rests on the assumption of what I call the infallible state. And so what I mean by that is that basically, if we're going to have the police using a series of data points to reconstruct your intentions and your behaviors, whether those are incriminating or exculpatory, and use that to predict your future behaviors, this relies on the assumption that all of the people collecting and entering and making decisions about that data are doing so without any errors or mistakes, without any bias, and without any prejudice. And that just flies in the face of empirical research on not just policing, but decision making in any kind of organization. So you have to believe that they would tell the exact same story about why you were at place 1, place 2, and place 3 that you would. And I think that, like, if we zoom out and think not about the criminal justice system, but like a more banal example, like let's say your girlfriend or your boyfriend sees a couple of text messages that pop up on your phone, and they read those messages, and you have no idea that they've read those messages. Okay. And they take those messages to mean that you're cheating on them, and they break up with you because they think that you're cheating on them, but you're not. And you don't know that they saw those messages. You aren't able to explain or contest any of those allegations or those conclusions. And, getting unfairly dumped might be like lower stakes than getting unfairly arrested, but the point is the same. And the stakes in the criminal justice system are very, very high a lot of the time. So if you think about DNA databases, for example, in order to be a hit or a match, you have to be in the database in the first place. And unequal rates of that kind of database inclusion can have very real consequences, like wrongful conviction. And in fact, empirical data shows that the risk of such outcomes is really unequally distributed, especially along racial lines. So for example, Black people are 7 times more likely to be wrongly convicted of murder than white people.
That's a problem, particularly given the consequences of being convicted of murder.
Yeah.
Wow. I knew the numbers were bad. I didn't know they were that bad.
Yeah.
And so as these bad numbers are coming out, I'm wondering if there are some good things to be said for surveillance. So why would we do it the way that we're doing it now? What are some arguments for?
Yes. Yeah. So there were a couple of things that there may be some promise in. And first is that big data or data generally can be used to correct for incomplete information sometimes. So police, like all of us, are operating with incomplete information. They're having to make decisions out on the street all the time when they don't have all the information that they need. And social psychological research demonstrates that humans are what is sometimes called cognitive misers. Like, we rely on these cognitive shortcuts. One of the most well demonstrated is the conflation of Blackness and criminality to make sense of the world. And so stereotypes like these become important and have the most cognitive utility. We rely on them the most when we have incomplete information. So if big data can be used to fill these informational gaps, it might improve police interaction with, in this case, minorities, by creating new priors or pieces of data to be considered in these subsequent interactions. So this might mean that the police may rely less on racist stereotypes, for example, in their policing. Another area of potential promise is that big data may be used to police the police. And I didn't see this happening a ton. The vast majority of big data policing efforts are definitely directed at tracking and predicting crime and criminal activity. But there may be some potential for good if we invert the surveillance lens or the focus of big data surveillance and direct it on the police themselves. So big data policing, just as I was talking about leaving all these digital traces today, big data policing leaves a digital trail, and digital trails are susceptible to oversight. And if we're able to sort of aggregate information on police practices, we may be able to shed light on systemic and institutional practices that are sometimes dismissed as like individual level bias, or particularly in conversations today about police brutality, the idea of a few bad apples. And it may provide this opportunity to sort of police the police and increase transparency and potentially accountability.
So, so that is those are some of the positives that I think a lot of critics don't fully think through. But there are also a number of negatives that are not completely obvious to a lot of folks. So could you talk about some of those other negatives, but beyond the sort of greater rate of false conviction?
Sure, yeah. So there are a number of ways that data is used in policing right now that sort of simultaneously amplifies and obscures existing inequalities. So what I mean by that is it exacerbates existing social inequalities in the world, but under sort of a veneer of objectivity. So we can think of, for example, just the basic idea of prediction, right? At its core, prediction is about using information about the past, holding up a mirror to the past and reflecting it into the future in order to make predictions about that. Well, in predictive policing, the past is historical crime data. And so if historical crime data is shaped in part by police practices, focusing disproportionately on minority and low-income neighborhoods, et cetera, that data is going to have inequality baked into it, and it will be projected in the future, thus exacerbating existing inequalities. Or if we think about, that's sort of often at like a neighborhood level, but if we think about person-based predictive policing, which I talked a little bit about in the article the students read, individuals get, 5 points if they're on parole or probation, 5 points for a violent prior, this kind of thing. And then officers are instructed to go out and stop individuals with the highest points values. Well, what ends up happening is the people with the highest points values are stopped. That further increases their points value because they get a point for every police contact, thus justifying their further surveillance. It kind of becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy or this feedback loop where, independent of criminal activity, their risk scores can go up and up. And all of this is occurring under this veneer of data-driven policing, or what one officer called it, just math.
Yeah. Oh, just math.
Yeah.
Which is why there was an earlier piece that you wrote where you just looked at all those other moments in which people have to fill out forms. And so you have to fill out banking, you have to fill out form for sort of healthcare, and
absolutely.
a lot of contact with police, and this feedback loop is creating more contact, then you're less likely to want to fill those things out. So
absolutely. That research showed precisely that. This was using nationally representative survey data, where it showed that people who had come into contact with the criminal justice system were avoiding places like hospitals and banks, places where they needed to show ID, use a digital trail. And in terms of exacerbating inequality through that process of system avoidance, like given that involvement in the criminal justice system is not equally distributed, the negative consequences of system avoidance, of not getting medical care when you need it, not having a bank account, I mean, you know a ton about that in your own work, like those are similarly going to be disproportionately distributed as well.
Yeah. So I'm just imagining that while you're out doing work with the LAPD and others, there must have been some moments that were just hard to take. Sometimes we're in these research sites and you're seeing the good and the bad. Great people of goodwill doing good stuff, and then you see some other things. But you wish that you can't unsee once you see it. So can you talk a little bit about some moments?
Sure. Yeah. So that's a great question. Like I love field work. It's really like why I do what I do and why I love this job. But it can take an emotional toll sometimes. So one of the challenges was really just seeing a lot of sad and violent stuff. So if you think about it, like a lot of the time when the police show up at someone's house or at a scene, those people are having the worst day of their lives, right? So I have seen teenagers that have been shot, mothers who have been beaten that are holding crying babies in their arms, and lots and lots and lots of mentally ill folks who are not getting the care that they need. And so that definitely was difficult. Another more sort of methodological, but similarly like emotionally draining thing sometimes can be a challenge for any qualitative researcher is dealing with things that come up that they don't agree with. So like if a respondent would make a statement in an interview, for example, that I thought was problematic, like maybe it was racist or sexist, I could probe about it, ask follow-up questions, ask them to explain a little bit more. But as a researcher, in that moment, it is not my job to intervene, to argue my perspective, or to get them to see my side in that moment. And so you have to bite your tongue sometimes, and or a lot. You have to bite your tongue
a lot. Oh, and then finally, just a quick word on what is the future of policing, given what's happening with big data?
Man, yeah, that's a really important question right now. So I think that the future of policing, well, it's very uncertain, but I think that to a certain extent, it's going to continue to involve data and technology. But I want to push back on this idea that big data policing and mass surveillance is sort of this inevitable outcome of technological advancement. You know, just the more digital traces we leave and the more technologies we have, the more police are going to use them. That kind of what's called technologically determinist thinking is sort of a trap, and it really ignores the social side of data. And what I mean by that is that mass surveillance is not this like natural result of mass digitization. Instead, what we allow to proliferate, what kind of information we allow to proliferate and become the objects of massive data collection efforts are really like a product of choices that reflect the political and social positions of the subjects and subject matter that we feel comfortable surveilling. So like as a counterpoint, take for example, guns in the US, right? We do not permit the mass tracking of guns. There is no federal gun registry. The national background check system is required by law to destroy all of the audit logs of background checks after 90 days. Now, we certainly have the technology to track guns. We could easily leverage that existing technology to do so, but gun owners are powerful political subjects that can push back against their own surveillance. So yeah, I guess in summary, like the police are probably going to continue increasing how much technology and data that they use. But as we're having this national reckoning about the future of policing, I think that we as sociologists and members of society have to think about and define not just what we want from policing, but what we want really from the institution of the police.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for this conversation.
For having me.